The cantina on Omega-7 station buzzed with quiet conversations in a dozen different languages. Smoke from various alien substances drifted through the air, creating a hazy atmosphere that made everything look dreamlike. In the darkest corner of the establishment, two figures sat across from each other at a small metal table. Commander Zixthul raised his glass with one of his forearms, the liquid inside glowing a soft blue color. His crystalline eyes reflected the dim light as he studied the young reporter sitting across from him. Velnara held her recording device steady, waiting for the old warrior to begin speaking. "You want to know about the humans," Zixthul said, his voice carrying the weight of many battles. His mandibles clicked together nervously as he spoke. Everyone does these days, but most people only want to hear the good stories, the ones that make them feel safe. Velnara leaned forward slightly. "I want to hear the truth, Commander. All of it." The old Kethvari veteran took a long drink before setting his glass down. His carapace, once a brilliant green, now bore the dull gray scars of countless conflicts. Each mark told a story of survival against impossible odds. "The truth," he repeated slowly. "The truth is that we were fools, all of us. The entire Galactic Council thought we understood warfare. We had been fighting for thousands of years across hundreds of worlds. We had strategies, protocols, and weapons that had proven effective against every species we encountered." He paused, his eyes growing distant as memories surfaced. Then the humans arrived. Zixthul remembered the day clearly. The Third Galactic Conflict had been raging for 2 standard years when Earth's representatives finally agreed to join the war effort. Most council members saw it as a desperate move. Humanity was young, their technology primitive compared to the great civilizations of the galaxy. "We looked at their data files," Zixthul continued. "Bipedal creatures with soft skin and no natural weapons. They lived maybe 80 of their years if they were lucky. Their ships were slow, their weapons basic. The Zephyrian hegemony had been crushing us with superior numbers and advanced tactics for months. What could these newcomers possibly offer?" The reporter waited patiently as the commander gathered his thoughts. She had heard rumors about human involvement in the war, but details were scarce. Most military records from that period remained classified. "I was assigned as a tactical advisor to observe their first operations," Zixthul said. "Standard procedure when a new species joins the war effort. My job was to evaluate their capabilities and recommend the best way to use them in combat. I expected to spend a few weeks writing a report about their limitations." He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Instead, I spent 3 years trying to understand how they consistently achieved the impossible." The first human ship Zixthul encountered was called the Terra Nova. It looked crude compared to Kethvari vessels, with thick armor plating and basic energy shields. The crew quarters were cramped, the corridors narrow. Everything seemed designed for function rather than comfort or efficiency. Their captain was a female named Susan Parker, Zixthul recalled. Small even by human standards, with brown hair and green eyes. She spoke softly and smiled often. "I thought she looked fragile, like most of her species. I was wrong about that too." Captain Parker had welcomed Zixthul aboard her ship with genuine warmth. She showed him around personally, explaining their equipment and introducing him to her crew. The humans seemed friendly and eager to please their new alien ally. "They asked me about Kethvari military traditions," Zixthul said. "They wanted to know how we fought, what we considered honorable, what strategies we used. I thought they were trying to learn from us to copy our proven methods." The commander's mandibles clicked faster now, a sign of agitation that Velnara recognized from her research on Kethvari body language. "I should have realized they were studying us, learning our weaknesses just as thoroughly as they learned our strengths." Captain Parker's ship was assigned to a routine patrol mission in the Kepler sector. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy activity in the area. It seemed like a safe assignment for the humans to get their first taste of real combat. "We were supposed to check 3 star systems and report back," Zixthul explained. "Simple reconnaissance work. Nothing dangerous. The kind of mission we usually gave to junior officers or new recruits. But the humans approached even this basic task differently than expected. Instead of following standard patrol routes, Captain Parker split her small fleet into individual ships. Each vessel took a different path through the sector, covering more ground but leaving themselves vulnerable to attack. "I question this decision," Zixthul admitted. "Our doctrine clearly states that ships should maintain formation for mutual support." Parker listened to my concerns politely, then explained that humans had different ideas about risk management. The HFY commander had watched with growing anxiety as the human ships spread out across the star system. They moved unpredictably, changing course without apparent reason, sometimes doubling back on their own paths. It looked chaotic and dangerous. Then we found the Zephyrian listening post, Zixthul said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, hidden in an asteroid field, completely invisible to our sensors. The humans detected it within hours of entering the system. The discovery changed everything. The listening post had been monitoring Galactic Council communications for months, feeding intelligence to enemy forces throughout the sector. Its destruction would blind the Zephyrians and give the Council a significant tactical advantage. Standard procedure called for immediate withdrawal and a full battle group assault. Zixthul explained. The post was heavily defended with automated weapons and shield generators. Any attack would require overwhelming firepower to succeed. Captain Parker had different ideas. She gathered her small fleet and began what looked like a retreat from the system. Zixthul prepared to write his report, noting the humans' sensible decision to avoid unnecessary casualties. I was actually impressed with their restraint, he admitted. Many young species would have attempted a foolish attack and gotten themselves killed. The humans seemed to understand their limitations, but the retreat was not what it appeared to be. While most of the human ships left the system openly, 2 remained behind, hidden in the asteroid field using stealth technology that Zixthul's instruments could barely detect. They waited for 3 days, Zixthul said. 3 days of complete silence while they studied the enemy base. They mapped every defensive system, tracked every patrol pattern, identified every weakness. When the attack finally came, it lasted exactly 12 minutes. The hidden human ships struck simultaneously from 2 different angles, targeting specific vulnerabilities they had discovered during their patient observation. The listening post's shields collapsed within seconds. Its weapon systems went offline, and its communication arrays were destroyed before any distress signal could be sent. Not a single human casualty, Zixthul said, staring into his empty glass. They made it look effortless, like they had done it 1,000 times before. The reporter waited for him to continue, sensing that this was only the beginning of the story. Zixthul signaled for another drink before meeting her eyes again. That was when I first realized we might have underestimated them, he said quietly. But I had no idea how badly. That little skirmish was nothing compared to what came later. The server brought Zixthul another glass of the glowing blue liquid. He wrapped 2 of his hands around it while gesturing with the other 2 as he continued his story. Velnara noticed the scars on his arm seemed to reflect the light strangely, as if they were made of different material than the rest of his carapace. The listening post incident was just the beginning, Zixthul said. Command decided the humans showed promise, so they assigned them to a real mission. Something with actual stakes. The mission was on Kef Prime, a jungle world that had become a key battleground in the war. The Zephyrians had established multiple supply depots throughout the dense forests, using the thick canopy to hide from orbital surveillance. Dozens of previous attempts to locate and destroy these bases had failed with heavy casualties. I was still assigned as their observer, Zixthul explained. My orders were to document human tactics and provide guidance when needed. I expected to spend most of my time teaching them proper assault procedures. The human force assigned to Kef Prime was relatively small. Captain Jake Miller commanded a unit called the 47th Terran Rangers, consisting of only 60 soldiers. Compared to the battalion-size forces that other species typically used for such operations, it seemed inadequate. Miller was different from Captain Parker, Zixthul recalled. Taller, broader, with dark skin and quiet eyes that seemed to notice everything. He spoke even less than she did, but when he gave orders, his soldiers responded instantly. The HFY commander had expected the humans to follow established doctrine. Standard procedure for jungle warfare involved clearing landing zones, establishing secure perimeters, and conducting systematic sweeps through the forest. It was slow but effective, minimizing casualties while maintaining communication with command. Instead, Miller's soldiers simply vanished, Zixthul said, his mandibles clicking with remembered confusion. One moment they were unloading equipment from their transport ships. The next they were gone. Disappeared into the jungle like ghosts. Zixthul had been left standing on the landing pad with a handful of human technicians and communication specialists. When he asked where the combat troops had gone, the technicians just smiled and pointed toward the forest. I had sensors, tracking equipment, heat detectors, Zixthul explained. Military-grade Kethvari technology that should have been able to locate a mouse in those woods. But I couldn't find any trace of Miller's soldiers. The human captain had left behind detailed instructions for Zixthul to monitor their progress through encrypted radio channels. Every few hours, brief status reports came through the communication system, position updates, reconnaissance data, and requests for orbital intelligence. But no matter how carefully Zixthul studied the reports, he couldn't understand what the humans were actually doing. They moved in patterns that made no sense, he said. Sometimes forward, sometimes backward, sometimes in circles. They avoided contact with enemy patrols even when they had clear advantages. It looked like they were lost or confused. Days passed without any significant action. Zixthul grew increasingly frustrated with what appeared to be human incompetence. Other species would have located and attacked at least one supply depot by now. The 47th Rangers seemed to be wandering aimlessly through the jungle. I recommended that Miller be replaced with a more experienced commander, Zixthul admitted. I sent reports to my superiors explaining that the humans lacked the aggressive instincts necessary for effective combat operations. On the 4th day, everything changed. Zixthul was reviewing intelligence reports when explosions began erupting across the forest. Not random detonations, but carefully coordinated strikes that happened simultaneously at multiple locations throughout the jungle. 17 Zephyrian supply depots exploded within a 3-minute window, Zixthul said. His voice filled with remembered amazement. Bases that we hadn't even known existed. Storage facilities, communication centers, weapons caches, fuel dumps, everything the enemy needed to maintain their operations in that sector. The strikes were followed by a series of smaller explosions as secondary ammunition stores caught fire. Smoke columns rose from a dozen different points across the forest, visible even through the thick canopy. In less than an hour, the Zephyrians had lost months of carefully accumulated supplies. But that wasn't the end of it, Zixthul continued. While their bases were burning, Miller's soldiers hit the evacuation routes. Every path the Zephyrians used to retreat from the jungle had been mapped and prepared with additional traps. Enemy forces fleeing from the destroyed supply depots found themselves running into carefully placed ambushes. Small groups of human soldiers appeared from concealment, struck quickly and vanished again before the Zephyrians could respond effectively. It was like fighting shadows. The Zephyrians never adapted to the human tactics, Zixthul explained. They kept trying to use conventional responses to unconventional attacks. They sent reinforcements down the same routes where Miller's soldiers were waiting. They established new defensive positions in locations the humans had already mapped and prepared to assault. The entire operation concluded within 18 hours of the first explosions. Miller's soldiers emerged from the jungle carrying detailed intelligence about Zephyrian operations throughout the entire star system. They had captured enemy communication codes, supply schedules, and tactical plans. 0 human casualties, Zixthul said quietly. Not just 0 deaths. 0 casualties of any kind. No wounded, no missing, no equipment losses. They had fought a perfect battle. When Zixthul finally had a chance to question Captain Miller about the operation, the humans' explanation was frustratingly simple. They had spent 3 days learning everything possible about their enemy before taking any action. Miller told me that humans always study their opponents carefully before fighting, Zixthul recalled. He said that understanding the enemy is more important than superior weapons or numbers. They had watched Zephyrian patrol patterns, learned their communication schedules, identified their supply routes, and mapped their defensive positions. The human soldiers had also studied the jungle itself, learning which paths were safe, where the dangerous wildlife lived, and how to move through the forest without leaving traces. They had essentially become part of the environment. I asked Miller how they had remained undetected for so long. Zixthul said. His answer was that they had learned to think like the jungle, to move when the animals moved, to hide when the animals hid, to strike when the moment was right. This philosophy of warfare was completely alien to Kethvari thinking. Their military traditions emphasized honor, courage, and direct confrontation with enemies. The idea of spending days in hiding before attacking seemed cowardly and inefficient. But I couldn't argue with the results, Zixthul admitted. Miller's 60 soldiers had accomplished more in 4 days than our previous battalion-sized operations had achieved in months. And they had done it without losing a single person. The success on Kef Prime led to more assignments for human forces. Each mission revealed new aspects of their unconventional approach to warfare. They seemed to treat every engagement as a puzzle to be solved rather than a battle to be won through superior force. I started requesting assignment to human operations, Zixthul said, not because I understood their methods, but because I wanted to learn how they consistently achieved impossible results. The reporter leaned forward, intrigued by the pattern emerging in the commander's stories. Did you ever figure out their secret? Zixthul's crystalline eyes dimmed slightly as he considered the question. I thought I did eventually, but every time I believed I understood human warfare, they would do something that proved me wrong again. He finished his drink and gestured for the server to bring another round. The jungle operation was just the beginning. Wait until you hear what happened at Arcturus Station. The cantina had grown quieter as the night progressed. Most of the other patrons had returned to their ships or quarters, leaving Zixthul and Velnara alone with their conversation. The old commander's voice had grown hoarser as he spoke, and his movements seemed more deliberate, as if each memory required effort to retrieve. Arcturus Station, Zixthul said, staring into his glass. 8 months under siege. 8 months of watching brave soldiers die trying to break through Zephyrian defenses. The station was one of our most important supply hubs, feeding resources to 12 different battlefronts. Velnara checked her recording device to ensure it was still functioning properly. The story of Arcturus Station had become legendary, but most versions she had heard focused on the final battle, rather than the siege itself. The Zephyrians had positioned a massive fleet around the station, Zixthul continued. 300 ships, including their newest battle cruisers with adaptive shield technology. They had mining platforms set up in the asteroid belt, turning space rocks into additional defensive positions. The siege had become a symbol of Zephyrian military superiority. Every species in the Galactic Council had attempted to break through their defenses. The Altharian fleet, known for their superior speed and maneuverability, had lost 40 ships in a single engagement. The massive Corvan dreadnoughts, built to crush any opposition, had been destroyed by coordinated missile strikes. 12 different species tried and failed, Zixthul said. Each attempt resulted in heavy casualties and no meaningful progress. The Zephyrians seemed to have anticipated every possible attack strategy. The situation had grown desperate. Food supplies on Arcturus Station were running low, and medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded personnel. Some council members had begun discussing the possibility of abandoning the station entirely. Then Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Stone arrived with the Human Relief Force, Zixthul said. 37 ships, most of them converted cargo vessels with improvised weapon systems. It looked like another doomed rescue attempt. Stone was a tall woman with red hair and pale skin marked by scars from previous battles. She carried herself with the quiet confidence that Zixthul had learned to associate with experienced human commanders. Her fleet looked unimpressive compared to the forces that had failed before her. I was assigned to observe the human relief effort, Zixthul explained. My superiors expected it to fail quickly, but they wanted documentation of human tactics for future reference. The human fleet approached Arcturus Station using standard formation patterns. Their ships moved predictably, following established protocols for engaging superior enemy forces. Zixthul had seen similar approaches dozens of times before. The battle lasted exactly 43 minutes, he recalled. Stone's ships fired a few volleys at the Zephyrian perimeter, took some return fire, then retreated in apparent disorder. Several human vessels appeared to be severely damaged. The Zephyrians celebrated their easy victory. Their commanders sent messages throughout the sector, boasting about defeating another rescue attempt with minimal effort. It seemed like the siege would continue indefinitely, but something bothered me about the human retreat, Zixthul said. Their damage patterns looked too convenient, too uniform, and their casualty report seemed inconsistent with what I had observed during the battle. Zixthul had requested permission to analyze the wreckage left behind by the human fleet. Standard procedure required careful examination of enemy technology and tactics after each engagement. What he found confused him even more. The debris field contained pieces from human ships, he explained. But the metal composition was wrong. The electronic components were decades out of date. Everything looked like it had been deliberately prepared to create false evidence. The mystery deepened when Zixthul discovered that several human ships had been reported as destroyed, but their escape pods were never found. In space combat, Escape pod recovery was usually automatic unless all personnel had been killed instantly. I started monitoring Zephyrian communications more carefully, Zixthol said, looking for any unusual activity that might explain what the humans had actually accomplished during their brief attack. For 2 weeks, everything appeared normal. The Zephyrian fleet maintained its siege positions, their patrols followed regular schedules, and their supply convoys arrived on time. There was no indication that anything had changed. Then small things started going wrong, Zixthol recalled. Equipment failures, communication glitches, minor accidents that disrupted normal operations. Nothing serious enough to raise immediate alarm, but enough to create confusion and inefficiency. The problems escalated gradually. Navigation systems began providing incorrect coordinates. Weapon targeting computers developed calibration errors. Shield generators required constant maintenance to function properly. Each incident was minor by itself, but collectively they created significant operational difficulties. Zephyrian commanders assumed they were dealing with normal equipment degradation, Zixthol explained. Space combat is hard on machinery, and extended deployments always cause maintenance issues. They increased repair schedules and requested additional technicians. The requested technicians never arrived. Supply convoys began experiencing delays and routing errors. Communication with Zephyrian command became unreliable. The siege fleet found itself increasingly isolated and under-supported. It took me 3 weeks to realize what was happening, Zixthol admitted. The humans hadn't retreated at all. They were inside the Zephyrian perimeter, living in the asteroid belt, systematically sabotaging enemy operations. The discovery was both impressive and terrifying. Somehow, during their brief engagement with the Zephyrian fleet, human soldiers had infiltrated the enemy defensive positions. They had been hiding in plain sight, using the asteroid mining platforms as cover while they conducted covert operations. Sergeant Ben Crawford was leading the infiltration team, Zixthol said. 23 humans living in improvised shelters carved into asteroid surfaces. They had enough supplies to last for months and equipment to monitor all Zephyrian communications. Crawford's team had identified every weakness in the enemy defensive network. They knew which systems were most vulnerable to sabotage, which personnel were most susceptible to deception, and which communication channels were least monitored. The humans were patient, Zixthol explained. They could have caused major damage immediately, but instead they chose to create gradual pressure. Each small problem made the Zephyrians less effective and more frustrated. The psychological impact was as important as the physical sabotage. Zephyrian soldiers began to doubt their equipment and question their orders. Morale declined as problems continued to mount without obvious explanations. The siege fleet became increasingly paranoid and disorganized. When Colonel Stone's fleet returned for the second attack, the Zephyrians were already defeated, Zixthol said. Their ships were scattered across multiple positions, their communications were compromised, and their commanders were arguing among themselves. The battle lasted 3 hours and 17 minutes. Human ships appeared simultaneously from multiple directions, striking precisely at the weakest points in Zephyrian defenses. Crawford's infiltration team disabled shield generators and weapon systems from within, coordinating perfectly with the external assault. The Zephyrians never understood what hit them, Zixthol recalled. They had been fighting ghosts for weeks without realizing it. By the time they recognized the threat, it was far too late to respond effectively. The siege was broken completely. Zephyrian survivors retreated in disorder, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape. Arcturus Station was not only relieved but became a forward base for future Council operations. 0 human casualties, Zixthol said quietly. Again. Despite facing overwhelming odds against a superior enemy force, they had achieved total victory without losing a single person. The reporter shook her head in amazement. How did they remain undetected for so long? Surely the Zephyrians had sensors capable of finding hidden personnel. Zixthol's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. That's what I asked Crawford when I finally met him. His answer was simple. They didn't hide from the sensors. They became part of the environment the sensors expected to see. The human infiltration team had disguised themselves as asteroid miners, maintenance workers, and supply personnel. They used forged identification codes and false work orders to move freely throughout the Zephyrian defensive network. When questioned, they provided believable explanations for their presence and activities. Crawford told me that humans excel at deception because they understand how people think, Zixthul explained. They know what details to provide, what questions to answer, and what behaviors will seem normal to observers. This ability to blend into any environment while maintaining hidden objectives was unlike anything Zixthul had encountered in decades of military service. Most species relied on technology or superior firepower to achieve their goals. Humans seemed to prefer manipulation and misdirection. The Arcturus operation proved that human warfare operates on multiple levels simultaneously, Zixthul said. They fight the obvious battle that the station's artificial day cycle had shifted to night mode, dimming the lights throughout the cantina. Zixthul seemed to prefer the darker environment, his crystalline eyes reflecting what little illumination remained. Velnara noticed that his scarred carapace looked even more battle-worn in the shadows. Gehenna 7, Zixthul said, the name carrying weight like a curse. The prison world. If you want to understand what makes humans truly dangerous, that's where the lesson begins. Velnara had heard whispers about Gehenna 7, but official records were still classified. The prison facility had been one of the Zephyrian hegemony's most secure installations, designed to hold prisoners of war from dozens of different species. 12,000 prisoners, Zixthul explained. Military personnel captured during the first 2 years of the war. The Zephyrians used the facility as both a detention center and a propaganda tool. They wanted to demonstrate their power by showing that no one could escape their custody. The prison had been built inside a massive asteroid, with multiple layers of security systems and automated defenses. The asteroid's orbit was carefully controlled to prevent rescue attempts, and the entire facility was surrounded by a network of sensor platforms and patrol ships. 17 different rescue missions had failed, Zixthul recalled. Each attempt resulted in heavy casualties and no meaningful progress. The prisoners were dying slowly from poor conditions and medical neglect. Something had to be done. Colonel Ryan Murphy had volunteered to lead the human rescue effort. He was older than most of the other human commanders Zixthul had observed, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes that suggested years of difficult decisions. Murphy arrived with a single ship, Zixthul said. Not a fleet, not a battle group. One modified transport vessel with minimal weapons and basic shield systems. I thought he was planning a reconnaissance mission. Instead, Murphy positioned his ship just outside the prison's defensive perimeter and began broadcasting on all frequencies. Not military communications or tactical orders, but something entirely unexpected. Stories. He told tales about human history, Zixthul explained. Battles his species had fought, heroes they remembered, victories they had achieved against impossible odds. Hour after hour, day after day, Murphy's voice filled the communication channels with these narratives. The Zephyrian garrison initially ignored the broadcasts, assuming they were some form of propaganda or psychological warfare. But Murphy wasn't trying to convince them to surrender or change their beliefs. He was simply telling stories. The first story was about a place called the Alamo, Zixthul recalled. A small fortress where human soldiers chose to fight to the death rather than surrender to overwhelming enemy forces. Murphy described every detail: the walls, the weapons, the faces of the defenders. The story lasted for hours, with Murphy providing historical context and personal details about each human involved. He explained their motivations, their fears, and their final moments. It was like listening to an ancient storyteller rather than a military commander. Then came Thermopylae. Zixthul continued, 300 human warriors holding a mountain pass against an army of hundreds of thousands. Murphy told their names, described their training, explained their tactics. He made them feel real, alive, present. The Zephyrian guard started listening despite themselves. Murphy's voice was calm and engaging, his stories vivid and compelling. He never threatened or demanded anything, just continued sharing tales of human courage and determination. Stalingrad was next, Zixthul said. An entire city turned into a fortress, civilians and soldiers fighting together against invaders. Murphy spent 3 days describing the siege, the suffering, the refusal to surrender even when defeat seemed certain. Each story followed the same pattern: humans facing overwhelming odds, fighting with whatever resources they possessed, never giving up hope. Murphy's narrative style made even ancient battles feel immediate and personal. The Zephyrian garrison commander finally ordered communications to be cut, Zixthul explained. But Murphy had anticipated this. He switched to emergency frequencies, backup channels, even maintenance networks. His voice kept coming through every speaker on the station. The stories evolved as days passed. Murphy began sharing more recent tales. Escape attempts from supposedly secure facilities, prison breaks that had succeeded against all expectations, rescues carried out by small teams against massive defensive forces. He told them about Colditz Castle, Zixthul recalled. A human prison designed to be escape-proof, where captives spent years planning elaborate breakouts. Murphy described every attempt, every failure, every small success that led to eventual freedom. The psychological pressure began affecting the Zephyrian guards. They found themselves checking security systems more frequently, reviewing procedures that had been routine for months. Murphy's stories made them acutely aware of every potential weakness in their facility. Andersonville was particularly effective, Zixthul said, a prison camp where human captives survived horrific conditions through cooperation and mutual support. Murphy explained how they organized themselves, shared resources, and maintained hope even when their captors wanted them to despair. The broadcasts continued for weeks. Murphy never repeated a story exactly, always adding new details or different perspectives. He seemed to possess an endless supply of tales about human resilience and determination. The guards started having nightmares, Zixthul observed. Murphy's descriptions were so vivid that they began imagining human prisoners planning escapes, digging tunnels, overpowering their captors. Paranoia spread throughout the facility. Equipment malfunctions became more frequent as nervous guards overmaintained their systems. Communication protocols were changed daily as commanders worried about security breaches. The prison's routine operations grew increasingly disrupted. Murphy started telling stories about specific escape techniques. Zixthul explained how humans had hidden tools, forged documents, corrupted computer systems. Each tale was presented as historical fact, but the details were suspiciously relevant to the prison's current vulnerabilities. The Zephyrian commander tried changing frequencies again, but Murphy always found new ways to broadcast his stories. Maintenance channels, emergency networks, even the facility's internal communication system somehow carried his voice to every corner of the station. The breaking point came when Murphy told the story of the Great Escape, Zixthul said, a massive breakout from a supposedly secure prison camp involving hundreds of captives working together over many months. He described their planning, their coordination, their willingness to sacrifice for each other's freedom. That night, 3 Zephyrian guards abandoned their posts without authorization. The next morning, 2 more failed to report for duty. The garrison commander found himself dealing with a growing crisis of confidence among his own personnel. Murphy's final story was about Alcatraz, Zixthul recalled, an island prison that no one had ever escaped from until 3 humans proved it could be done. He spent an entire day describing their preparation, their timing, their disappearance into the night. The following morning, the Zephyrian commander sent an unconditional surrender message to Murphy's ship. The entire garrison laid down their weapons and requested immediate evacuation from the facility. They no longer trusted themselves to maintain security. Murphy never fired a shot, Zixthul said quietly, never threatened anyone directly, never demanded surrender. He simply told stories until the guards became too frightened to continue their duties. The rescue operation proceeded without resistance. Murphy's ship docked with the prison station, and human personnel began evacuating the 12,000 prisoners. The Zephyrian guards helped with the evacuation, eager to leave the facility behind. 0 casualties on either side, Zixthul noted. Murphy had achieved total victory through pure psychological warfare. He had convinced the enemy to defeat themselves. The reporter leaned back in her chair, struggling to process the implications of what she had heard. How is that even possible? How can stories be more powerful than weapons? Zixthul's mandibles clicked slowly as he considered the question. Murphy explained it to me later. He said that humans understand the power of narrative because their entire civilization is built on shared stories. They know how to use words to create fear, hope, doubt, or determination. The colonel had also revealed that every story he told was true. The battles, the escapes, the acts of courage and determination, all were part of documented human history. He wasn't creating fiction. He was sharing his species' actual experiences. That's what made the story so terrifying, Zixthul explained. The Zephyrian guards realized they weren't hearing propaganda or threats. They were learning about real events, actual capabilities, proven methods that humans had used throughout their history. Murphy's psychological warfare had been perfectly calibrated to exploit Zephyrian weaknesses. He understood that their rigid military culture valued security and order above all else. By introducing doubt and uncertainty, he had undermined the very foundations of their effectiveness. The most disturbing part, Zixthol said, was that Murphy's stories were just a tiny sample of human history. He told me that his species the cantina had grown completely quiet, except for the soft hum of the station's life support systems. Zixthol sat in silence for several minutes, his four hands wrapped around his empty glass while his crystalline eyes stared into the distance. Felnara waited patiently, sensing that the old commander was gathering himself for something important. "You've heard the stories," Zixthol finally said. "The victories, the impossible achievements, the ways humans consistently defeat superior forces through unconventional thinking. But you haven't heard the truth yet." The reporter leaned forward, her recording device capturing every word. She had expected this interview to cover standard military history, but Zixthol's accounts had revealed something far more complex and disturbing. "The truth is that everything I've told you represents humans fighting with restraints," Zixthol explained. "Like warriors wearing heavy chains, deliberately limiting their own capabilities to meet some internal standard of acceptable conduct." During his years observing human military operations, Zixthol had gradually become aware of references to something called the Geneva Convention. Human commanders frequently consulted thick manuals and legal documents before making tactical decisions. "I thought these were technical specifications," he recalled, "equipment manuals or strategic guidelines that humans use to optimize their effectiveness. I was wrong. They were limitations." The Geneva Convention, Zixthol learned, was a set of rules that humans imposed on themselves during warfare. These rules prohibited certain weapons, protected specific categories of people, and established minimum standards for treating prisoners and civilians. Admiral Patricia Ross explained it to me during the Kepler campaign, Zixthol said. "She told me that humans had learned to limit their own destructive capabilities because unlimited warfare was too dangerous for their species to survive." Ross was a stern woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around her. She commanded the largest human fleet in the war, but her tactical decisions were constantly influenced by legal and ethical considerations that other species found incomprehensible. "Ross showed me weapons that humans possessed but refused to use," Zixthol explained. "Biological agents that could devastate entire worlds, chemical compounds that would make planets uninhabitable for centuries, nuclear weapons that could crack continents." The Admiral had walked him through a secure facility where these weapons were stored under multiple layers of security. The technology was sophisticated and terrifying, representing centuries of human innovation applied to destruction and death. "She told me that humans had used these weapons in their past," Zixthol recalled. "They had poisoned their own atmosphere, contaminated vast areas of their homeworld, and nearly destroyed their civilization through unrestrained warfare. The lesson had been learned through bitter experience. Humans had discovered that their capacity for violence and destruction exceeded their ability to control the consequences. Their species had survived only by agreeing to impose strict limitations on their own military capabilities." General Kevin Hayes confirmed this during our conversation about the Titan offensive, Zixthol continued. He explained that human military doctrine was designed around the principle of proportional response and minimal necessary force. Hayes was a broad-shouldered man with dark skin and intelligent eyes who spoke carefully about every aspect of military strategy. His unit had achieved remarkable success against Zephyrian forces, but always within carefully defined parameters. Hayes told me that humans possessed weapons capable of sterilizing entire star systems, Zixthol said. Automated machines that could consume planets, transforming matter into additional copies of themselves. Technologies that could manipulate space and time itself. These revelations had initially seemed like boasting or propaganda. No species in the galaxy possessed such capabilities, and the Galactic Council's scientific consensus held that many of them were theoretically impossible. "But Hayes showed me the mathematical proofs," Zixthol explained. "The research data, the test results, the prototype devices locked away in secure facilities. Everything was real, functional, and deliberately unused." Human scientists had apparently developed these technologies during periods of desperation in their species' history. Wars that threatened their very existence had driven them to create weapons of unimaginable power. But each victory had come with terrible costs. Hayes described something called mutually assured destruction, Zixtel recalled, a strategic doctrine where both sides in a conflict possessed enough destructive power to completely annihilate their opponents, making warfare suicidal for everyone involved. This concept had forced humans to develop new approaches to conflict resolution. Instead of relying on superior firepower, they had learned to use psychology, deception, patience, and precise application of force to achieve their objectives. That's why human tactics seem so strange to us, Zixtel realized. They weren't fighting to demonstrate power or achieve dominance. They were fighting to accomplish specific goals with minimal collateral damage. The restraints went beyond choice of weapons. Human military law required protection of civilians, humane treatment of prisoners, preservation of cultural sites, and respect for neutral territories. These obligations significantly complicated their tactical options. Colonel Murphy told me about the rules of engagement that governed human operations, Zixtel said. Detailed protocols that specified when force could be used, what targets were legitimate, how much damage was acceptable to achieve military objectives. Every human commander carried personal responsibility for ensuring their actions complied with these regulations. Violations could result in court-martial, imprisonment, or worse. The legal system was designed to punish excessive violence even when it might have been tactically advantageous. I asked Admiral Ross what would happen if humans removed these restraints. Zixtel said quietly, if they fought without rules, without limitations, without concern for consequences. Ross had been silent for a long time before answering. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that Zixtel had never heard from any other military officer. She told me that unrestrained humans had nearly ended their own species, Zixtel recalled. Multiple times throughout their history, they had come close to extinction through their own capacity for violence and destruction. The Admiral had explained that human warfare without limitations became a form of madness. Their species possessed an instinct for total commitment that could escalate conflicts beyond any rational objective. Once restraints were removed, stopping became nearly impossible. Ross said that humans at full capacity weren't soldiers. Zixtel said, they became something else entirely, something that destroyed everything around them until nothing remained worth fighting for. This revelation had changed Zixtel's understanding of everything he had witnessed during the war. The impossible victories, the unconventional tactics, the precise applications of force, all represented humans operating at a fraction of their actual capabilities. The Galactic Council never fought humanity, Zixtel explained. We fought humans who were trying to be like us, civilized, restrained, operating within acceptable parameters of conduct. The Zephyrian hegemony had made the same mistake. They had assumed that human limitations were weaknesses rather than choices. They had never understood that they were facing an enemy who was deliberately holding back. That's why we could never predict human tactics, Zixtel said. We were trying to understand warriors who were simultaneously fighting two battles, one against us and another against their own nature. The old commander's mandibles clicked rapidly as he considered the implications of his own words. The most terrifying thing about humans isn't their technology or their cunning, it's their restraint. He looked directly at Velnara, his crystalline eyes reflecting the dim light of the cantina. The galaxy should pray that humans never decide we're an existential threat to their species, because if they ever stop holding back, if they ever remove their self-imposed limitations. Zixtel's voice trailed off as he contemplated scenarios too disturbing to articulate. He had spent years studying human capabilities, learning about their history, understanding their potential. The knowledge had given him nightmares. Admiral Ross told me something else, he said finally. She said that humans had survived as a species because they learned to fear themselves. They understood that their greatest enemy wasn't external threats, but their own capacity for unlimited destruction. The reporter sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what she had heard. The heroic stories of human military achievements suddenly took on a darker aspect when viewed as examples of a species fighting while deliberately handicapped. Why are you telling me this? Velnara asked. Why share these secrets now? Zixtel smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. Because the war is over, and the galaxy still doesn't understand what really happened. We think we know humans because we fought alongside them for 3 years. But we only met the version of humanity that they chose to show us. He stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, the scars on his